Welcome now to the Symbolism and Naming PowerPoint for Ms. Montgomery's English 112. This is the second PowerPoint to go along with the short fiction unit we are beginning the course with. When we think about symbols in literature and the other arts, we want to concentrate our thinking on a kind of duality. Symbols will be objects that stand for themselves and for something else. So in a story, there will be a literal sunrise. It's literally the end of the night, but that also might symbolize hope or a fresh start. Or a character wearing a red shirt, maybe literally dressed in a red shirt, but the color red might also symbolize passion or anger or energy. Also, symbols can be other than physical objects. They can be different kinds of ideas. They can be people. They can be customs. That first bullet of conventional, public, cultural, and universal symbols are symbols that will have fairly broadly accessible meanings, at least within a particular cultural group. Think of something like what Kate Chopin does with the new spring life in the open window in The Story of an Hour. The use of the cycle of the seasons or other metaphors from the natural world is pretty broadly accessible. You're going to get a lot of people who can fasten on to that symbolic meaning. Whereas private, personal, contextual, private, or authorial symbols will be symbolic objects that don't have a necessarily obvious or a necessarily broadly applicable meaning, but they do have a meaning within a particular story. One of the famous examples of this is the sled rosebud from the classic film Citizen Kane. Sleds in and of themselves don't have any particular broad symbolism the way that rain or snow or sunrise do, but within the context of that story, you have a symbol created. William Blake and William Butler Yeats, who we will read in the poetry unit of the course, were famous for creating their own in-context symbols. And symbols will derive meaning from cultural and historical tradition. Think of the use of terms like Judas or Benedict Arnold to mean traitor. Those take their meaning from specific historic people. Common social usages and associations will give items or phrases symbolic meaning. I'm sure you've all had a discussion with your grandparents about how slang language has changed between your various generations. Symbols, again, can come from the natural world. Agriculture, the cycle of the seasons, the danger inherent in various kinds of weather. Those are going to be concepts that will be accessible in many times and many places. And then the private and authorial symbols will come from specific constructs within a literary work or across an author's body of work. Take a moment to think about perhaps a favorite television show of yours, or a movie you've seen, or a novel you've read that features one or more of these kinds of symbols. Symbolism, then, is symbols used in a systematic way, perhaps in conjunction with each other, or several symbols of winter, several symbols of anger. System of symbolism might be used across a work, across many works, or as a signature of an author's career. Ernest Hemingway, for example, is very famous for his use of rain to contribute different kinds of emotional atmospheres and to create those in his novels. Life cycles of the earth and seasons and farming information are very common and famous in the works of the American poet Robert Frost. Take a moment to think about the few works we've already read together in the course. Consider the symbolic function of the catacombs. Literally, they are down in the catacombs, but then committing a murder in a cemetery is very practical. Montresor has a pretty good chance of getting away with hiding a body in a cemetery. And also, it is an atmosphere of death, and he goes there to commit a murder. The open window in The Story of an Hour. Openness represents new opportunities, new freedom. Faith Brown's name in Young Goodman Brown is a great example of a symbolic name. Literally, of course, her name is Faith, but she also represents, of course, Young Goodman Brown's struggle with his religious faith and his either failure if you look at it that way, or moving past that faith. Take a moment to think of other symbols, names of characters, objects, colors, sounds, in the works we've read thus far or in other works with which you are familiar. And naming is a particularly important practice in fiction. They are often symbols in and of themselves. Montresor, my treasure, he's storing Fortunato away. It's a near anagram for monster. Fortunato, it's a bit like a bad joke. He's not so fortunate after all. Homer Barron, who we will meet in A Rose for Emily, is part of a very barren relationship. One of the great namers in recent fiction is J.K. Rowling. If you think of the classical allusions and historical allusions and place names in so many of her characters' names. Suzanne Collins has also done this more recently in The Hunger Games with the use of classical references for many characters' names. Think also of name changing. Think of various religious and cultural ceremonies that involve formal naming or formal name changes. Think of the changing of a name upon baptism or marriage or divorce. Or, for example, within the British Empire, when people are honored, they become Sir Anne McKellen, they become Dame Judi Dench. We've seen the use of names in The Story of an Hour. She's referred to as Mrs. Mallard. From the start, she is identified in terms of her husband. And then after she has that awakening, her sister calls her Louise. She's identified in terms of herself. Think again of other examples of particularly creative uses of naming you might have seen or read. Epithets are another category of names. They're almost like official titles. They come from classical literature and they can be positive. Homer repeatedly talks about the wine-dark sea, gray-eyed Athena. Think of Alexander the Great or Edward the Confessor, monarchs and rulers from history who have compliments in their titles. Glinda the Good Witch of the North. Or epithets can be negative. Ivan the Terrible is known to history in that way. One particularly unsuccessful English king is known to history as Ethelred the Unready. You have Glinda's counterpart, the Wicked Witch of the West, and various derogatory terms can also attach themselves to characters as epithets. And when you think about reading for symbols to do your discussion board posts or to write your essays in this and other classes, one of the things English teachers are often accused of is over-symbolizing and looking too deeply into everything. People don't really enjoy watching television and movies with me because I'm constantly saying, look, there's a classical reference, look, there's this kind of symbolism. But what you want to do as an academic strategy is strike a balance. You want to read actively, read attentively, and be open to meanings. If there seems to be a lot of the color red in a story, or a lot of military metaphors, or a lot of emphasis on a detail, on an object, look into it, see what it might mean, see what the author might be giving you beyond what is just there on the page. But also recognize that not every object or image in every literary work is going to be some great symbolic function. Think of the famous quote from Sigmund Freud that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So chase down your ideas in reading literature, but if you have to abandon something, it's not going to work for an analytical reading after all, go on to the next idea and trust your instincts. And symbols in figurative language are presented in all sorts of formats. These are some of the more famous ones. Allegories, fables, parables, and the other kinds of stories are typically extended symbols. Think of the fables and the fairy tales you knew as a child, like the tortoise and a hare, where the elements and the characters in a story represent moral qualities or represent good decisions and bad decisions. And then at the technical level, you'll have different kinds of ways of stating a comparison. Metaphor is a comparison without like or as. Simile is a comparison with like or as. Analogy, all of those are ways of comparing two things in terms of each other. Metonymy is juxtaposition, setting things side by side. And then synecdoche means part from the whole. Think of the way we use the White House to refer to the entire apparatus of the presidency, or in Great Britain, people will say number 10, which is number 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives, and it's a shorthand for the government. And there again are the works cited for this presentation.